Hi, this is Alice, and I'm here to talk to you about Youth Who Reason Exceptionally Well Mathematically and/or Verbally by Linda Brody and Julian Stanley. It's basically discussing the SMPY, or the Study of Mathematically Precocious Youth program at Johns Hopkins University in Maryland that was started in 1971 by the author Julian Stanley. And the program was initially started to meet the needs of exceptional learners and students, one in particular named Joe, who was 13 and was recognized as having high ability and indeed did well on the SST and was placed in Johns Hopkins and ended up graduating with a master's degree at 17. From that one initial student, SMPY began to grow, and several students started to pop up on the scene, and they started to realize that there was a way to accelerate courses for these high ability learners by placing them in a special program. Then it talks about how that was the history that it was talking about. Then it started to talk about how they expanded the search when they created the CTY at Johns Hopkins, which is still in existence today, which is one of the programs that helps find talent, and they offer programs in the summer. It has grown as the years have um, have passed, and now the program is in place in several different countries. The model that they use at Johns Hopkins is the MVTD4 model, which is the mathematically and verbally talented. And then they talk about the discovery, description, development, and dissemination of the talent or the exceptionalities of these students. When they start to conceptualize giftedness, the authors kind of differentiate the two aspects of basically the academically gifted or high ability people who learn at a faster rate, and then they also talk about the creatively gifted who have talents that need to be fostered in special programs. They also talk about how sometimes when you have the conception of giftedness, how asynchrony makes it problematic to identify gifted students because they might be very high in one area but extremely low in another area, and therefore they don't come across as being gifted. They also talk about how when giftedness can be identified as when you're an adult through adult achievement, and therefore it might be better to just use the words precocious and exceptional when identifying young students. And therefore you're focusing more on their potential and less on their giftedness, because in fact we are the ones who are responsible for creating programs for them. And when you give the word giftedness, it makes it seem like it's a done deal, whereas it's only a done deal when you're an adult. That's when your potential is really coming into fruition. And as the adults for these students, we need to make sure that their programs are meeting their needs. They also talk about how should gifted individuals be identified, and they talk about the general IQ test. They talk about how that's helpful, but that's not the only way to identify gifted students or precocious students, because it's measuring, again, only one aspect. And that one of the things that I really liked about this article was talking about how when you're trying to instruct a gifted individual, you should think about them as in terms of an ILP, where you're assessing where they are, you're assessing what their strengths are. You have basically a psycho eval, which will explain in what areas you need to focus. You can do a strength-based approach to their education, and that way you can individualize their learning as best as possible so that you can hone in on the exceptionalities and or their talents, and really push them in the area that they need to be pushed. But this requires a lot of flexibility and willingness on the part of not only the educational system, but the teachers and parents who are involved in the gifted student's life, as well as the gifted students themselves, to be treated in a different way. It asked how the achievement of a gifted student should be assessed. And it basically that goes back to an ILP, which is saying what kind of goals you can set for them in their areas of strengths and weaknesses, so that therefore you can assess whether they're growing appropriately. And also, there's also tests, they don't talk about this, but there's also tests like MAP scores and the SAT, which are standardized tests that you can help assess in a more kind of objective way. Um, and then in the conclusion, they talk about how people are hostile towards intellectually talented youth and how they're a little less hostile towards people who are really talented musically or sport wise. And they wonder why this is, and they question that. And even this prejudice goes back, it says, to Shakespeare. And there's even a quote that I thought was kind of sad: "Early ripe, early rot," which is kind of a negative projection for what might happen to a highly able student. Um, and they talk about how there's certain how we don't really address the needs of gifted students because we expect them to be able to manage on their own because they're smart. But then we have the underachievers who actually things come naturally to them and they're never able to learn how to survive in the system because they just go about on a from their own natural abilities and are never really engaged in the classroom enough to understand how the system works and then end up underachieving. And basically, they're saying that there's a nice quote at the end where it's like, a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? And then it says, a mathematically precocious youth's reach should exceed his or her grasp, or what's an educational system for? Which goes back to the idea that we are the ones responsible for gifted students' educational needs. The adults are the ones that need to address this. The people in education need to take it seriously. And we need to do that by identifying them in various ways and by being flexible in the educational system, and allowing them to have their needs met through an ILP or through different programming, which will allow them to grow and become successful, gifted adults. Thank you.